everyone. Welcome back to A Second Look, and I should say welcome back to Narnia. As many of you know, the third episode of the famous Chronicle of Narnia novel series by C.S. Lewis is now playing in the theaters and not doing too badly. It didn't take the box office by storm, but neither did Johnny Depp or Angelina Jolie this last weekend. Now, the Narnia series is a series of films that the film industry is doing that is bringing about the screening of the famous 7-part series by an author named C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis is someone we've talked about before here on A Second Look. And since he did deal a lot with science fiction and fairy tales, and since he's now made the movies, I thought what we would do tonight would be to bring along an actor and a writer and tell us a little bit about C.S. Lewis, maybe get a little bit behind the scenes. And this man's name is Mr. Alan Doshna. Al, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
And as one of your latest writing projects, you've delved a little bit into the world of science fiction. I think we have a picture up there of an interview you did. Describe that for us.
Right, yes. It was an interview with a very special lady named Pauline, or Polly Wagner, who is led a very interesting life and is writing her autobiography. But the most notable thing, or probably the most famous thing that people have heard about, was that they don't associate her with it, but she was a stand-in for Fay Wray in the original classic King Kong.
The backup
right,
for the famous
the scene on top of the Empire State Building, which
right.
was she was sworn to secrecy at the time, and it wasn't until just about a year ago when her manager encouraged her to speak.
It jumped out, and I think we have a picture of you and her name is Polly Wagner that we're going to put up there for our home audience to have a look at to show that you really know your way around this subject here.
Right, that's
King Kong.
Right, for Film Facts magazine. It's not out yet, but it should be out probably within the next.
There you go, with the name King Kong prominently listed. So studying Hollywood and some of the smaller movies that get made and interviewing for Film Facts some of the people that others may not know about, all of this, in a way, has prepared you for taking on C.S. Lewis, right?
Right.
Now, because this is the third show we've done on Lewis, and I wanted to bring along someone who wasn't quite familiar with him, and I just wanted to get your reaction to C.S. Lewis as an actor, as a man who works in the industry.
Right. Well, I was really kind of blown away by his work. Of course, I'd been familiar. I'd heard the name in different circles, Christian as well as his writing. But it wasn't until recently that I had actually read some of his material, and including the Dawn Treader book, which was just released as a movie, and it was just like nothing. It was just I feel kind of jaded about a lot of the things, but it was truly,
yes,
mind-opening.
You've dealt with science fiction. You've been in science fantasy. You've had things, but some of these things in Dawn Treader really did get your attention.
Right. He was just very open about it. It was kind of like a cross between Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Dr. Seuss meets Edgar Allan Poe. He just had this a creative well that he drew from.
Exactly.
And just very.
Speaking of Poe and H.G. Wells, this was one of Lewis's early reading. And interesting, you mentioned Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds as being a way out. The lead character in this movie is Lucy Pevensey.
Right,
so there's
just connection.
The ghost of Lewis must be around here somewhere. So you were surprised that this tweedy-suited, pipe-smoking Northern Irishman could actually come up with. Well, you were fascinated by the duffel pods,
right? The monopods, and he is very insightful as to human nature. And to me, it struck me as being that here he was considered, he was an Oxford professor, theologian, and then he had this other side to him of a science fiction fantasy writer, which is fascinating. And I think that it represents just the colors that he had inside of himself that he just expressed through his life. He had a very hard life in some areas, and so he was just kind of letting his hair down in a way. And
interesting comment.
Fascinating. Right.
Yeah, that's what's interesting, because you were aware of him, but you're now and for purposes of this show, I might add, just for our audience to know, we're going to have a picture of Lewis up there pretty soon, so you'll get an idea. His mother did die when he was about 10 years old. He was wounded in World War I in 3 places: the hand, the side, and the leg, and came out of it a very bitter man. Went to Oxford, which really didn't improve his relationship with Christianity, and yet he ends up writing what is considered, and I wasn't aware of all of this years ago when I first read Lewis, what is considered a foundational series of fiction or fairy tales, I suppose you'd call them. So what were the Duffel Puds?
Right, they were a group of people that had a spell put on them that were invisible when they first appeared, or didn't appear in the book and the movie. They were invisible, and so you had this phenomenon occur when they were bringing dinner out. It was kind of flying through the air, the dishes as they were being brought out, and as it turned out, they were originally dwarves, but then through another spell had been turned into these kind of one-footed creatures. But the funny thing about them was that it was his satire of people that just didn't really have a clue about things, whether their relationship with God or other people, but just had kind of lived in the world of their own, and just you try to help them, but they just were almost beyond help. That's probably a good way to summarize that. That's a part of the Dawn Treader movie that my wife got a kick out of. I know that. I was ready for it, so I wasn't too blown away. But of course, Hollywood loved, or Britain, wherever this was filmed, loved Walden Productions. Had these one-footed creatures. You almost have to see them to believe them. And this is what science fiction or fairy tales do, I guess. They allow us to think about life from a different angle, which Lewis was so good at. Right. It was kind of a midway point for getting across ideas that are hard to put in concrete terms, being human beings seeing things in practical terms. I think that one example of that I always think about is the series MASH, which is set in the Korean War, and yet it's about the Vietnam War, and that happens so often. Right. And helps to put a little distance. Yeah. That's the word, distance. You were also fascinated, as you went through some of Lewis's writings, about the aspect of joy. Right. One of his most famous books, Surprised by Joy. Right. And it just kind of struck a chord with me, because just certain things I'd noticed both in my own personal life as well as just society in general, but just the definition of joy. I'd like to quote from a book, a very prestigious, you have a very authentic source here. C.S. Lewis in Narnia for Dummies, but it quotes from one of his works that the author says, to Lewis, joy is an intense desire or romantic longing for something that nothing on earth ever truly satisfies. You can catch a glimpse of it, but it always remains just out of your reach. As Lewis writes in his poem Dimer, joy flickers on the razor edge of the present and is gone. But later, after he becomes a Christian, he began to understand that it was actually an ingrained desire for God and his far-off country, as quote-unquote. And quoting Lewis from his essay, The Weight of Glory, the books of or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them. That is, if things become an idol to us in this life. The point he was making was that the physical things we enjoy, we experience that have such an emotional impact are just kind of a reflection. If we pay too much attention to them or try to lock them down too much, we find that they don't satisfy us in a way that if we had just see them for what they are, kind of a fleeting
sort of like
foretaste.
A framework, and if we look at the framework and don't get the while you're talking, I'm thinking that Lewis, one of his famous lines is, if we're never satisfied by the things we see here, as beautiful as they are, and of course he was big on beauty, experiencing joy through, if we're never satisfied by music or poetry or life or marriage or whatever, he says that just shows we're made for something else. We're made for another world. And in the movie The Dawn Treader, that's the name of a boat, and the boat's on the way to Aslan's country. And Aslan, of course, in the Narnia, as you know now, you have cracked the code with your authentic source book here. Aslan is Lewis's depiction of Christ in the Narnia series. And I think we have a picture of the movie poster, and you'll see that great big lion there in the middle. And when you do, you realize this is the character who invented Narnia and who works through all of the Narnia series. Aslan the lion, and him and Lucy have a special relationship, and that's, don't want to spoil the movie, but there you go. Yeah, this was interesting too, what you said about things that flicker on the razor's edge of happiness, but don't quite go all the way.
Right, and that's been his experience, and that just is, I think we see it even today, papers, newspapers, people that don't have that experience, perspective of life.
Well, that might be a good time to just talk about how Lewis is the serious defender of Christianity. It took him a long time to come to Christianity, and I think one of his friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, you and I talked about that earlier, said to a pupil of Lewis's at Oxford, "You'll never get to the bottom of him." And it is really something about great men. Like Nancy Reagan said, there was a part of Ronnie I could never understand, and there's something deep there. But Lewis does become a Christian, mainly through the fact that even some of the skeptical professors of Oxford begin to wonder if there wasn't something to the Christ story after all. And Len Lewis becomes, in the 1940s and 50s, this great champion of Christianity. And we're going to show our television audience right now a clip from an interview I did almost 10 years ago with a Duarte resident who now works for the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, a good friend of mine named Mr. Joe Costantino. And we're going to look at some of Lewis's serious stuff. We've talked about the Duffel Puds, Narnia, Lucy in the Sky with Diamond. He was out there, right? From what you're seeing and reading, he was out there. Like you said, you listened to the tape of the Dawn Treader book, but it was the novel that made you laugh out loud.
Right. I was kind of reading, kind of going over both at the same time, but it was the printed word that really made me laugh when I went over it again.
Oh man, would Lewis ever be happy with that statement? He was perhaps one of the most well-read men of the 20th century, and he wrote 25 books on Christian themes. Here is why Christians rally around Lewis, why he was on the cover of Time magazine in 1947, was his tremendous intellect and the way he handles the question of morality and values. Again, now this is a tape from about 10 years ago. I look a lot younger, had a little bit more here, but I think you can stand this if you just catch this interview with Mr. Costantino, who's from the C.S. Lewis Society. This was 10 years ago. I think a good place to start now is with his most famous book, Mere Christianity. We're going to put a quote up for our TV audience to have a look at here. Mere Christianity was written in 1952, and in there Lewis begins to show his brilliance as far as a moralist, a defender of the Christian religion, a defender of faith, and he gets into what he calls the law of human nature, showing that there is indeed a moral principle behind the universe. This quote's going to be up on the screen here, probably very soon, and I want you to comment on it for us, and I'll read it to you, and our TV viewers can read it themselves. Whenever you find a man, this is Lewis, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in real right and wrong, you will find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he will be complaining, "It's not fair," before you can say Jack Robinson. So is this typical of Lewis's style?
Absolutely. Lewis lived in an era which as he described it, at least to start out with, people could be pretty well convinced of something when you demonstrated its logic. And so Lewis was often involved in debates with people about the validity of Christianity and about the existence of God. And one of the arguments, this is one of the arguments that Lewis would use, and that is the existence of a moral law, the pretty much universal understanding of, this is right and this is wrong. He said, some people say, well, that's culturally determined. And he said, well, try to find me a country where people are admired if they, do in their closest friends
or leave a battle or something.
Run the opposite way when their wife or children needs to be defended, and those are values are so universal they must come from somewhere.
And very clever arguments indeed. He calls it the law of men's consciences. I've heard a friend describe it as the law of the World Series ticket. If you showed up at the World Series, you've got 2 tickets, and 2 people are sitting in your place during the World Series. All of a sudden, you believe in morality, right? This is Lewis's point, the law of men's consciences. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're watching, and if you just tuned in, you probably figured out this is a show about C.S. Lewis, the author of the movie that's out right now called Voyage of the Dawn Treader, about the same characters we meet in the first 2 Lewis novels who are on their way to Aslan's country, which we know by now the secret is out. Aslan is Christ in Lewis's fiction. And I'm interviewing Mr. Alan Doshna, who's an actor and a writer, a published author, and he is familiar with Lewis, but just brushed up on it for this show because I thought it would be nice to have someone fresh to come in and talk about it. So, what does it take to put together this kind of to be this kind of a man who can talk about morality on one level and fairy tales on the other?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's what makes him such a compelling figure as an author and a personality, that he has that dimension to him, because I think in more recent times we have just a kind of a stereotype, and sometimes it actually does happen this way, that people look at things in a very one-dimensional.
And Christians. You're thinking of Christians. You might as well say it.
That he had he lived his life in a full way and expressed himself in a way that is not normally associated with Christianity, of having all this deep emotion and colorful imagery that is not is actually kind of pushing the envelope.
Yeah. He reminded you, like you said, of a famous artist for Mad Magazine.
Right, Basil Wolverton, who was an inspiration to me, who was most famous probably for Mad Magazine, but he would do these kind of offbeat caricatures.
Lena the Hyena.
Right. He won a contest through Life magazine for a caricature he did, this kind of a just offbeat a character, Lena the Hyena, but she appeared in Little Abner.
Oh, okay.
But later became a character.
Yeah, that's your first time we talked before the show. You said, you were a bit blown away by the fiction and the capacity.
In fact, it's interesting that Basil Wolverton was also a science fiction author. Right. So, I mean, there's that speculative aspect, but I think that the tendency is to kind of stereotype or pigeonhole that if a person has faith, that it's only within certain parameters, and sometimes from the inside, sometimes people who are artistic bent, are discouraged or but we need to let our light shine, as it says. That
Christianity is not known for upholding science fiction and fairy tales. Matter of fact, sometimes the very opposite.
Right, and so he could get away with it in a sense that he's actually making a very positive statement, but that if it was someone else that we might be more critical or something, but there's more. The point is that there's more to the story than on the surface.
It's almost the old line, only Nixon could go to China, and in some ways only Lewis, who's such a devout Christian, by the time he reaches his 40s and 50s, could write these enchanting stories as well. And to show you what a tough mind Lewis had, and how you must not write him off when you go to the Narnia, when you go to the Dawn Treader movie, which I hope you'll all do. We're going to play you another clip of something called the trilemma of C.S. Lewis. This really gets down to brass tacks as to why this man was on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most well-known Christians and one of the most well-known defenders of Christianity in the last century. That's the 20th century. So here's another clip of my interview with Joe Costantino of the C.S. Lewis Society some 9 years ago. And of course, Lewis is a Christian, and I love the way he recounts his conversion in 1929, the most dejected. He'd finally proved it logically, yet his heart didn't quite follow. Okay, I've got to go along with this, the most dejected convert in England in 1929, and then becomes this ringing champion of Christianity, and as such, he evolved what some people call the trilemma. We're going to put that up on the TV screen, which I think you'll easily be able to comment on. Students of Lewis talk about his famous formula called the trilemma, that when it comes to Jesus Christ, and this is where he shows Christianity to be his choice for his religion, when it comes to the Jesus Christ himself, you have three choices. He's either the Lord, a liar, or a lunatic. What does he mean by this?
He says that a lot of people would like to take the person of Jesus Christ and say, well, he has some wonderful teachings, and his moral judgments are very sound, and if we all lived by those, it would be a nice world. But please don't bring in anything about deity or supernatural. He's just a wonderful teacher. And what Lewis points out is that if you take the words of Jesus at his word in the New Testament, the way he describes himself as God, and someone who would say the things that he did about himself and not would have to be either that person. If he was going to be sane, he'd have to say that, or he'd have to be, as Lewis says, as insane as someone who claimed he was a boiled egg.
Right, that's it.
So he said you can't have it both ways. You can't have a nice teacher who's not divine,
or his great claims
condemned out of his
right.
condemned with his own words, if that's the way you take it. So you'd have to selectively take some teachings and throw the others
right.
out, which of course some people have done.
Right. Well, you're doing well. You're giving us chapter and verse from Mere Christianity. As Lewis said, a man who was merely a man who said the sort of things Jesus Christ said, and if they weren't true, he wouldn't be a great moral teacher. You couldn't believe what he said. He would be a liar, or to claim that he was the Son of God would put him in the, as we call it, the funny farm. Now, it seems to me obvious, Lewis says, he was neither a lunatic nor a liar, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he is God. God has landed on this enemy-occupied world in human form. Now, that answers the question we had earlier. Is this relevant today? Are Lewis's writings up to date today? Well, if you've just joined us, we are analyzing the man who wrote Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is a popular movie out right now for this Christmas season, which we hope you'll get a chance to see. And it's hard to believe that the man who wrote this, science fiction, wrote this, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which is the book that Mr. Joe Costantino was explaining 9 years ago on a second look. I'm here with Mr. Alan Doshna, who's an actor and a writer, and we're talking about the fact that Christians have a hard time with the imagination.
Right. And it's kind of sad in a way that I think that there's the negative spiritual influence of wanting to believe, or actually giving away the territory to negative spiritual influences, and that's exactly like his book, The Screw Tape Letters. It's one of the C.S. Lewis's book that for Christians to be scared away from participating in artistic endeavors, using the imagination, give away the entire territory to Satan.
Right.
And that's. But on the surface, it looks like a Christian point of view, when actually it's a form of surrender. And you're sometimes part of a group called the Hollywood Prayer Network that quotes the scripture, God did not come into the world to condemn Hollywood, but that Hollywood through him might be saved. I know you remember that one. So it's interesting that
the trilemma that we just talked about, and I think you've been reading up on Lewis, and I've been reading up, so I can talk to you about your reading on Lewis. I only found out recently that Ronald Reagan, when he was asked in 1978, why do you believe as a Christian, and he used the Lord Liar Lunatic argument, as did Chuck Colson of Watergate fame, who was given mere Christianity by one of his Christian friends, and that's one of the great things that came out of Watergate was the turnaround of Chuck Colson.
Right. Well, one thing that I've noticed about the books that, of course, they weren't intended as allegories of the Christian faith, but that the relationship with Aslan is kind of a one-on-one with the people. There isn't actually, as far as I've seen so far, there isn't actually even something that suggests a text or a Bible or anything. It's direct communication with people. So in that sense, he stands on his own terms.
Yes, in other words, that's just the one and only Christ. If Aslan is Christ, and we've actually got Aslan's picture, which we'll keep showing you here a little bit as we go through the last 3 or 4 minutes. It's interesting that if people like Ronald Reagan and Chuck Colson of Watergate fame, if these famous public figures can be touched by Lewis's spiritual writings, it is incredible that this is the same man whose novels are now playing at the AMC.
Well, interestingly, like the book, I have the CD, book on CD of Dawn Treader was read by Derek Jacobi, who is one of the prestigious British actors. So I think his appeals across the cultural and spiritual spectrum.
Yes, you mentioned the Screw Tape Letters, and of course for C.S. Lewis readers, that's one of the classics, right? It's about a senior devil writing to a junior devil about how you can get an advantage over Christians.
Right. Being the devil's advocate.
Yeah, right. He does this a lot in his fiction. I'm not an expert on his science fiction, but I did read the second Paralandra, where Lewis reverses everything. When most of the movies that it's monsters out there, but what he does when human beings go into outer space, they are the monsters. Right. They're the danger.
Kind of like Pogo. We've seen the enemy, and he is us.
Right. So here was a lot of intellectual horsepower, and I would say when it's all said and done, Lewis is going to emerge as one of the premier, if not the most influential Christian writer, as a secular writer, because he never claimed to be a theologian, and he said, I'm not a minister, so I shouldn't be saying this. But
Right. In fact, that's one of the things that I admire about him, is that he didn't wear his Christianity on his church sleeve. He was, which is fine. I mean, if someone wants to, do that kind of work, it's directly spiritual music or performance, but for someone to appeal to a general audience, where it comes as an outgrowth of who he is as an artist, rather than hammering his viewpoint on people.
That's a great point to end on, because Lewis, in the Dawn Treader movie, you see this. There's not when people hear that Christians are excited about Lewis in these movies, that shouldn't mean it's a Christian movie. You have to look long and hard to see that, because it's just part of him. It's the creativity, the imagination. He made the imagination safe for Christians. That sounds like a good note to end on. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts with us as a man from Hollywood and the entertainment industry. And for all of you in the audience, we'll see you next time on A Second Look.